Good morning, everyone. My name is Eva Feldman, and I'm the director of the Taubman Institute. I realized last night that in the last decade, serving as director, I have begun or introduced over 20 symposia in this auditorium. And for me, today's symposium, entitled Strategies to Empower Women to Achieve Academic Success, is really the highlight of this past decade. So I have to tell you, the idea is actually not mine originally. Dr. Durga Singer held a smaller but similar event in October of 2016 for women in basic science. That really made me take pause and step back and look at the broader question of the pipeline of women in academic medicine at Michigan Medicine. And we decided that we should have a similar but broader event for all of our women in the medical center and within the health-related disciplines in the university. So I approached Dr. Singer, and I also approached the assistant managing director of the Taubman Institute, Dr. Stacy Jacoby, and asked them if they would help me organize a similar but broader event. And so today's event is really due to their tireless efforts. We really have an exceptional program. And I'd like to start, before I introduce the first speaker, by thanking them very much. Would you stand up? So, it's really my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker. So Dr. Reshma Jagsi, quite a remarkable CV. So Reshma graduated first in her class at Harvard College, went on to Harvard Medical School, and then obtained her PhD at Oxford University as a Marshall Scholar. She is really, in a very short amount of time, having joined our faculty only in 2006, so in a short 11 years, established herself as really the national leader in gender equity in medicine. She currently is a professor and associate chair in the Department of Radiation Oncology, and is also the new director, I want to say this correctly, Reshma, the new director of our Center for Bioethics and Social Services in Medicine. It's my great pleasure to welcome her to the podium.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you. Yes, and my apologies for the acronym CBSSM. It is a difficult center, but everyone should remember the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences in Medicine is there to serve. All right. Perfect. So what I'd like to do over the next half hour is briefly review with you some of the data that have been collected. So specifically beginning with women's current participation in medicine, and then some evidence that I and other researchers have collected that suggests that there's dysfunction in the pipeline. We'll then talk a little bit about the nature and causes of gender inequities in academic medicine, and conclude by talking about some really creative, targeted interventions that have been developed to try to ameliorate the situation. So as we all know, women have not been nearly half of all medical students for all time. In fact, it was only after Title IX and some important cultural changes in the early 1970s that we saw the dramatic increase in women's participation in the medical profession. But as you can see from this graph, and I want you to keep this point in mind, over 20 years ago, women constituted more than 40% of all medical students. And it's been actually quite some time that women have hovered around nearly half of all medical students. So when we think about the pipeline and how long it takes for things to percolate through, I do think it's important for us to keep that in mind. The concern is that low proportions of senior academic positions are held by women in medicine. In 2013-14, which was the most recent year for which AAMC data were available, only 1 in 5 full professors were women, 15% of department chairs, and 16% of medical school deans. And when we look at women's representation amongst authors in the high-impact medical journals, which is of course very important because the academic discourse, the way that we influence the direction of science, comes from publication. when we look at this, we find that only 12.7% of the senior authors of original research in the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, and Annals of Internal Medicine combined in 2004 were women. Now, this study came out of a conversation and a committee experience that I had. I was privileged as a resident to serve on the Women in Academic Medicine Committee at Massachusetts General Hospital. And we were talking at the end of one of the meetings about how depressing it was, because at the time, the New England Journal used to publish the first and last names of the authors, not just the first initial as it does now. And young women like me, every week would get the New England Journal and see names like John and Henry, but no names like Nancy and Mary. The generationally appropriate names that should have been there were not there to serve as role models for me. And I thought to myself, my goodness, no one who looks like me, forget with a foreign-sounding last name, is represented on the pages of this journal. Maybe we should quantify this. One of the reporters who did press on this actually cleverly chose not just to interview me, but actually to interview the editors at the New England Journal who decided to accept the manuscript for publication. And it was interesting, the quote that they got commented that they had very little control over this first bar here, that they had fair processes. Of course, they never gave me access to the data to see what manuscripts came in because of confidentiality, but they really believed their processes were fair, and there was something upstream occurring that was keeping women from reaching the point of generating research worthy of publication in the New England Journal. But they did comment that the second bar there, invited editorialists, was within their control, and only 11% of the invited editorialists then were women. And that number has grown dramatically since that time, not simply because of this paper, certainly because of changes in general in the pipeline and in the awareness and in the submissions. But it was really nice to hear that they thought that was something they could change. Now, to get back to the first point, whether the process is fair, I'll simply mention one consideration about the system of single-blind peer review that's utilized in these journals and most of the other ones in our fields. Single-blind peer review means that authors don't know the identity of their reviewers, but reviewers generally are informed of the identity of the authors. And the concern there is that unconscious bias can play out in those situations. And do we have any evidence that that's the case? Well, it used to be there were no women on symphony orchestras. And it was thought that this was due to some inherent physiological difference between men and women, that there was greater lung capacity to blow into a large, low brass instrument, or greater finger span to master Rachmaninoff. But it turns out that when they introduced a very simple intervention, a screen between the auditioner and the evaluator, that all of a sudden it was clear that women sounded like they could play music. They just didn't look like they could. So when we consider whether our processes are fair and whether there's anything we can do, we do need to scrutinize approaches like double-blinding peer review. I'm very proud to say that the journal of my field, the International Journal of Radiation Oncology, Biology, Physics, which is almost as elegant a title as the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences and Medicine, I didn't name either of them. It is the premier journal of my small field of radiation oncology, and it has instituted double-blinded peer review with really heartening enthusiasm within the community. We actually surveyed all of our authors and reviewers and found that even though it was more burdensome, because it takes work to blind a manuscript, you have to take out references, it also makes it more burdensome for reviewers, but actually there was overwhelming endorsement of the double-blinded process. So why does this matter? I think it's helpful to conceive of the arguments into two classes. I promise this is the only bioethics-y kind of slide I'll give you. I did take one too many philosophy classes in college. So there are two classes of arguments that are made about why gender equity matters. One class is deontological. In other words, it derives from the fundamental respect that we owe to one another as human beings. As human beings, we have the ability for rational thought and the capacity for freely willed action, and that merits respect for its own sake. And so we must act in ways that positions that are highly desired, like senior positions in academic medicine, are equally available to all. So it's the equal opportunity to reach those very sought-after positions. And it's It's right because it's right, not because of any ends it achieves, but simply because it's the right thing to do. Now, these are philosophically and morally very compelling arguments, but sometimes they're not all that effective. And I think that many of the individuals in this audience may at some point be negotiating with someone else for resources to promote gender equity within your department, within your division, within your program. And it turns out that saying to a leader, we need to do this because we need to do the right thing, we need to do it because it's fair, sometimes we'll put the person who's on the other side of the negotiation table on the defensive, because of course no one thinks that they're being unfair. And I truly do believe, and I don't think that I'm naive, that most leaders wake up in the morning and think, how can I make the world a better place, not how can I oppress the women that are working for me. So sometimes these deontological arguments don't resonate because leaders already think that they're doing their best to be fair, and things are very complicated, and we all know this. So what about those teleological arguments? The teleological arguments tend to be very powerful. Teleological arguments are ends-based, consequentialist arguments. We should do this not only because it's right for its own sake, but because it achieves some ends that are of importance to us. So what might those ends be in an academic medical center? Well, we all know that we have a tripartite mission, right? We are serving research, we're serving education, we're serving a clinical population, right? Well, it turns out that half of our patients are women, and so having women in senior clinical administrative positions is extremely important to ensure that our services are appropriate for the half of the population that we serve who are women. It turns out that nearly half of our medical students are women, and so for our educational mission, it's incredibly important for us to have women in leadership positions to serve as role models so that we have a robust pipeline through academic medicine and through the medical profession more generally. And finally, for research, there is considerable evidence that shows that when you bring together individuals who've had vastly different backgrounds and life experiences together, that this diversity improves academic inquiry. So I often get asked, do you do this because you're interested in women's health? And my answer is yes, I'm interested in women's health. I'm also just interested in health. It doesn't simply mean that having women in senior positions will influence the questions we ask about women's health issues. It will influence the questions and the approaches we take to all health issues. And this is, I think, a particularly vivid depiction of the second teleological argument I mentioned, the role modeling argument. So this is from the four major specialties within which we require all medical students typically to rotate. The absolute numbers of full professors and residents. And so you see the baby pink and the baby blue bars are the trainees, they're the residents. And then you can see in absolute numbers how few female full professors must serve as role models to all of these baby pink and baby blue bars. And note that even in fields like OBGYN and pediatrics, where the female residents outnumber the male residents, the female full professors who are serving as the role models are still very, very few and far between. So maybe we shouldn't worry about this. This is the most common comment that is made to me. This will all work itself out. Don't you really believe that people do wake up in the morning and wish to do good, and this is just something that's going to work itself out with time? I wish that were the case. I thought that would be the case. That's why I pointed out the 1990 benchmark of going over 40% of female medical students, because it's actually been a really long time that women haven't been a small minority of the medical school class. And this pipeline hypothesis is that it's simply a really long way to get to seniority in academic medicine, right? You know, we start off as students, and then we have to do residencies, and we do PhDs and postdocs sometimes, and we start off, then we do our residency training, our fellowship training, we go on as instructors, assistant professors, associate professors. It's just a really long pipeline. So Lynn Nonamaker did the best sort of study of this type of question, because what she did was she did a cohort study looking at cohorts who graduated medical school from 1979 to 93. And what she found was that the proportion of women who advanced to the rank of associate professor was significantly lower than expected in all but 2 of the 15 cohorts. And even women who reached the rank of associate professor were less likely to become full professor than their male counterparts. And it was no small difference. The difference between observed and expected was 5 standard deviations off. Okay? Huge difference. Now, there were a number of criticisms of this study. One is that the data were, I mean, as time has passed, has been that 1979 to 93 is a long time ago. So wonderfully, there was a paper in JAMA just a couple of years ago that took doximity data and showed that very little has changed. That's not, of course, wonderful, but it's wonderful to at least give evidence to the fact that this hasn't changed. One of the other criticisms, though, has been that in Nonamaker's study and in that doximity study, individuals with different career goals were being pooled together, and that it was very difficult to determine whether similarly situated, apt and motivated men and women were being treated, sorry. Oh, okay, sorry. I thought you were trying to tell me. I'm like, I know what time it is.
I was going to get that out of there.
Similarly situated, apt and motivated men and women were having different outcomes, or whether the women who were in these cohorts entered academic medicine for systematically different reasons. So if women enter academic medicine because we wish to provide clinical care in a team-based academic environment, or we wish to educate the next generation of scholars, and men enter academic medicine because they wish to advance scientific inquiry, and if academic medical centers, as they often do, place primacy on the research mission over the educational and clinical mission, then what you see here in terms of advancement might not reflect disparate treatment of similarly situated individuals, but might actually reflect a different treatment of those pursuing different aspects of the tripartite mission. And so to investigate this, this was sort of the one good idea that I've had. I decided that I would look at a population where that couldn't be argued. So K08 and K23 awardees. As many of you know, these are highly competitive grants made by the National Institutes of Health to junior academic medical faculty who hold clinical doctorates. And what's neat about this population is they have a demonstrated aptitude and commitment towards research careers. These are extremely competitive grants, right? And so to get them, one has to be a fully grown-up adult who articulates that one wishes to have an independent scientific career. And so this is a population where even Larry Summers himself couldn't argue that the women are less apt or less focused on research. So the articulated goal of the program is to foster career development into independent investigators. And so as a social scientist myself, there's actually a measurable endpoint there, because the NIH itself said the most common independent grant is the R01, and while it's not the be-all and end-all, we would like to see K awardees developing into R01-funded independent investigators. And so here it was, my ideal study population, homogeneous, recent cohort, among whom success would be expected given the amount of societal resources that are invested in their success, and where differences might lend insights into the mechanisms that underlie those differences that previous studies had shown. And so this is the first study that we did where we simply went to CRISP data. So CRISP is the old form of the reporter database. I say simply because I had a poor research associate who spent her entire year verifying that women didn't change their last names due to marriage, and that our discovery here was not due to name changes due to marriage. Turns out it was not, and she's written a very lengthy appendix so that no one else ever has to go and make sure that Mary Smith did not become Mary Jones. But she did actually have to search every Mary after Mary Smith to make sure Mary Smith didn't become Mary Jones. What we found, because I'm an oncologist and I view everything in terms of actuarial survival curves, is that the 5-year rate of R01 attainment was only 19% among women and 25% among men, and that on multivariable analysis, gender was an independent significant predictor of R01 attainment after we controlled for everything that the publicly available data had. So we controlled for K award type because K08s are more basic science, K23s are more patient-oriented. The year of the award, because we know that it's become increasingly difficult to achieve independent funding over time, and we know that women are percolating into the pipeline more recently, so that might affect things. We looked at funding institutes, so perhaps men are applying to cardiology and oncology, and women are applying to child health, and maybe we as a society underfund the subjects that women pursue. We looked at institution. It turns out that women actually are less represented at the Michigans of the world and are more represented at lower tier institutions overall for NIH funding and specialty. And even after we controlled for these factors, we saw a significant difference. And this is concerning because once one's K award runs out after 5 years of funding, it is very difficult to have the protected time and focus to then go on to achieve an independent research grant. And so as one of my oncology colleagues pointed out, this wasn't bad. This was a good idea of looking at this, because the failure to achieve an R01 is kind of like having distant metastases. It doesn't bode well for overall survival in an academic medical career. When we looked at broader outcomes measures, including more broad measures of grant attainment, so not just R01s, but R01s or any grants totaling $1 million or more in direct funding as PI, publications in the top tertile of all of these individuals, or leadership positions like department chair, division chief, dean, what we found was that, hearteningly and as expected, the rates of success go up. So now we see that over half of the women and nearly 3/4 of the men are successful, but the gender difference persists. And not only are there differences in success, but there are differences in compensation after controlling for all of the measures of productivity and success, including academic rank, receipt of grants, publication, work hours, time spent in research. So what we found was that there was about a $32,000 difference between the men and the women in this cohort. Much of this, as I hypothesized, and I actually thought this was all we were going to show in this paper, was that much of it was due to specialty, because it turns out that it doesn't pay all that well to prevent someone's cancer. It pays a lot more to zap their cancer, and I say this as a radiation oncologist, right? I think it's quite unfair that I get paid a whole lot more by our society for engaging in a procedural specialty than somebody who prevents someone from having a cancer altogether in the first place. Looks like the difference goes down almost by half by controlling for specialty alone. But even after you control for everything else that we measured, and I mean, we had a lot of measures there, the residual difference was still $12,000 a year. So what drives these differences? Well, we have differences in specialty choice, but I put that in quotation marks because, of course, women may be encouraged to occupy lower paid specialties, and specialties chosen by women may pay less partly because they're predominated by women or involve less valued feminine behaviors, like the communal behavior of counseling rather than the agentic behavior of cutting something out or zapping something with an instrument. Differences in productivity, hours, and willingness to change institutions may also be very important in a gender-structured society where women are far less likely to marry down in terms of socioeconomic status and educational status. So 90% of the women in this sample were married to full-time working spouses. More than half of the men in this sample had part-time or non-working spouses. Now, we did actually control for whether they actually changed institutions. So we controlled for what we could. Differences in rank and leadership themselves may reflect biased processes for determining rewards. So it's almost a double whammy, but we tried to be conservative in our analysis. We controlled for rank. So we almost said, there was a biased process, so you don't get to be the department chair, but the department chairs get paid more, so we're going to say that it was justified that we pay you less. We actually controlled for leadership and for rank. And even after that conservative approach, there was a substantial unexplained gender difference. So what's going on? Maybe there's gender differences in values or behavior. One possibility is that mothers might be more likely to sacrifice pay for unobserved job characteristics like flexibility, and fathers might wish to earn more to support their families. But we're talking about a relatively homogeneous job type here, and we found no interaction between gender and parental status, which means that even the women without children had lower pay than men. So this can't be the exclusive explanation. More interestingly is this phenomenon of women don't ask, right? So Babcock and LeShaver wrote the famous book, Women Don't Ask, and the subsequent book, Ask for It, which I commend to anyone who hasn't read it. Negotiation behaviors are very different between men and women, and we, as a society, view women who negotiate in the exact same way as men differently. And so it turns out that this is very important because we're not just talking about compensation, we're talking about negotiation. And negotiation doesn't just influence compensation, it influences access to all of those critical resources that are necessary for success in academic medicine. It's also possible that there is some difference in the employer's behavior towards men and women. There is this phenomenon that labor economists describe as statistical discrimination, whereby employers make inferences based on group characteristics. It could be the mean, it actually could be other group characteristics, rather than individual characteristics when setting salaries. It is an efficient heuristic. But it can lead to differences. And then there's this concept of the family wage, this idea that there's a single male breadwinner and that we should pay people based on what it is that they need rather than what they produce at work. And so all of these differences can conspire to create the differences that we see here. And particularly important is the role of unconscious bias. We all hold deeply ingrained notions of gender roles. And there was a wonderful National Academies report that states that an impressive body of controlled experimental studies and examination of decision-making processes in real life show that on the average, people are less likely to hire a woman than a man with identical qualifications, less likely to ascribe credit to a woman than a man for identical accomplishments, and when information is scarce, will far more often give benefit of the doubt to a man than a woman. And there's plenty of qualitative studies and anecdotes within academic medicine. My favorite quantitative study is the survey study that was done asking academic psychologists whether they would hire a particular candidate. And then the name was changed between Karen Miller and Brian Miller, and it was randomly assigned. They got one CV, and they were asked, we're doing a hypothetical study, look at the CV, we're interested in what different institutions consider hireable and important, and it turns out that Karen Miller is not only less likely to get hired, but she's objectively rated as having less good research, service, and teaching. And that's based on the same exact CV with only one change, Karen instead of Brian. In addition, we face an unlevel playing field. Seemingly gender-neutral norms, practices, and policies can have a disparate negative impact upon women. These include policies regulating parental leave from training, which of course disproportionately impact the one sex that bears children and lactates. Expectations regarding work hours, which in our gender-structured society have a disparate impact upon women. And phenomena like tenure clocks and limits on grant eligibility, because women are more likely to exit or go part-time for childbearing in our society. And so the mechanisms by which this occurs is the forced collision of professional biological clocks and the magnification of the inequities of our traditionally gendered division of labor in our society. And this, I think, is really compelling. So these are Generation X K awardees. So that first study led to a subsequent study. This was actually R01 funded. This is K awardees from 2006 to 2009. And we asked them how they spent their time. So labor economists think of time as being spent on paid labor and unpaid labor. So first, no big surprise, the women are not doing less total labor than the men. But when you look at those dark green bars over here, that is parenting and domestic tasks. And what you can see is in this K awardee sample, they're spending about the same time teaching, not very much. They're spending about the same time in clinic. They're spending the same time on other work-related tasks. And what gets squeezed out by this excess of domestic labor is research time, right? It is the most flexible component of our workday. And so unfortunately, we're seeing that filter through to the work experience. And what I found really striking, so this was an 8.5 hour per week difference on multivariable analysis, was that we asked the respondents, when your child care falls through, it's a snow day, your nanny's sick, your usual child care arrangements fall through, who deals with it? And the options were, I deal with it myself, my spouse or partner deals with it, we share it pretty equally, or we alternate, we have someone else we turn to. It turns out that 42% of the women, 42.6% of the women say, I deal with it myself. Only 12.4% of the men do. So even in this highly apt, motivated, able, K awardee subset, Generation X, because these are individuals who got it between 2006 and 2009, we're seeing patterns that are actually quite similar to patterns of domestic labor division in general society, which is actually, I think, remarkable. And then that's not it either. There's also issues with overt harassment and discrimination. This was supposed to be my good news study because I thought that I could say, I keep showing bad news. This was going to be my good news. Things have gotten so much better since the last time a study was done of this. In 1995, there was a wonderful study that was done, and so I replicated those questions in our most recent survey. And in 1995, 55% of the women in a cross-sectional sample of faculty had reported sexual harassment. And I thought, well, in 1995, if you take a cross-section of faculty, you have some faculty who are older, who went to medical school in the 1980s, when women were a very small proportion of the medical school class. The literature on workplace harassment and discrimination suggests that those kinds of experiences are more common when women are in the marked minority. So in this Generation X sample, we're going to have some good news to report. I really want good news to report. Well, we found that it's better, but still 30% of the women in this very recent cohort reports sexual harassment, and this was by a superior or colleague. So some of the press that went out, people misinterpreted this as women face harassment from patients, which certainly occurs, but this was actually harassment from a superior or a colleague. 40% were more severe forms, 59% perceived a negative effect on confidence in themselves as professionals, and 47% reported that the experiences negatively affected their career advancement. And of course, these small differences over time accumulate. This is a computer simulation model that actually shows that if you take a hierarchical organization and you staff it 50-50 men and women, and you give everyone a competency score, and you put it on a normal distribution, and then you shift the two normal distributions for men and women apart by just a little so that 1% of the variance is accounted for by bias factor. If you have 15% attrition at every level and you fill from within, that organization goes to 65% male at the top. So these differences accumulate over time, and concrete targeted interventions are required. Fortunately, just as many of the practices that contribute to gender inequity appear on their face to be gender neutral, interventions do not need to be obviously gender specific either, and I firmly believe that success with initiatives at one institution should be shared at other institutions in order to promote development of similar programs elsewhere. And so one class of programs is mentoring programs. Note that I don't say mentorship, but I say mentoring programs because I'd like to put the responsibility on the institution rather than on the individual woman. We're not about fixing the women, but we are about supporting the women. Mentors are wonderful in a variety of ways because they allow access to opportunities. They help women play games not learned in childhood. Probably my favorite paper ever is this one titled here, Batting 300 is Good, Perspectives of Faculty Researchers and Their Mentors on Rejection, Resilience, and Persistence in Academic Medical Careers. To the extent that some women didn't grow up playing on baseball teams and learning that they need to get it back up to bat, mentors can be critical in that role. They can teach those negotiation skills, and ideally will be structured as networks rather than hierarchical dyads. This is a study that we recently published that showed differences by gender in experiences of sponsorship. So having been put up to serve in a prominent national role on a committee as an oral discussant, as a panelist, these kinds of opportunities that powerful individuals can make possible for junior individuals, distinct from the more skill-building aspects of mentorship, and only possible for a subset of mentors who actually have those connections, and a scarce resource to be allocated. And what we see is that women are being allocated fewer of these, and so I think later in the morning we'll hear about some initiatives here and elsewhere that seek to promote sponsorship with considerations of equity. Because ultimately, gender equity has to be promoted through recognition and changes at the institutional level. There's some wonderful interventions that have been described, including a group of distinguished scholar awards that target a period of particular vulnerability when women are active in child rearing, and so it provides how can we maybe provide bridge funding support during this period of vulnerability. This has actually been extrapolated. I wrote about it when I was a resident. It was an idea from Mass General. It's now been taken up by the Doris Duke Foundation, who has funded the Fund to Retain Clinician Scientists, which is now being implemented at 10 medical schools across the nation. And I have the privilege of serving as the program evaluator. And the need for this type of program is so dramatic that we're seeing in these early years. There are many initiatives towards bias literacy and cultural transformation, and initiatives that seek to develop transparent and consistent criteria for advancement and compensation. So in conclusion, women have made substantial strides, but a gender gap does remain at senior levels in our profession. The cause is not simply a slow pipeline. Even similarly situated men and women do not appear to be rewarded similarly, even today. And therefore, institutions and the leaders within them, many of whom at our institution are fortunately sitting in the audience, it's really nice to see, must develop targeted interventions to support gender equity and the success of this major contingent of the medical workforce. And I want to acknowledge the contributions of my many, many, many collaborators and the funding that we've received. Thank you very much.
That was just really superb. We'll be taking questions at the end of both talks. Thank you, Reshma. It's, every time I hear you speak, I just think, wow, you know, there's so much we need to do. And on that note, let me introduce my good friend, Janet Bickle. Janet and I have known each other for over 25 years, and she was one of the mentors that allowed me, I think, to be successful in academic medicine. She has spoken at over 125 medical schools and institutions, and 35 professional societies. She's really the leader nationally in this field in terms of helping us come up with solutions to the problems that Reshma has just discussed with us. Janet really began the career that I know most about at the American Medical College, the Association of American Medical Colleges, the AAMC, where she began an office known as the Office of Women in Medicine and started a whole series of programs that women from throughout the country would attend as assistant professors, associate, and eventually full professors. She's influenced probably most of the major women in academia today, and we're really pleased to have her join us from Washington, D.C. And the title of her talk, she's going to tell us, what are we learning about how women can increase their influence? Thank you so much for coming.
It really is an honor to be here today among so many eager faces and so many great researchers and clinicians. And I have a lot to say and not much time. Thank you. So when many of us started this work, in my case it was in 1987 at the Association of American Medical Colleges, we assumed that the pipeline was the main thing. And we have discovered, and Reshma's and many other investigators' great work has helped us appreciate the complexity of this picture that we still see today. Work that's come not out of academic medicine that you might not have seen. For instance, that in children's books today, boy characters still have 3 times more words than the girl characters. And a recent study I found of 7-year-olds found that girls were much less likely than the 7-year-old boys to say that they were really, really smart. I know that doesn't apply to your daughters, but in many parts of the country, it's still true that underestimation begins so early. So a few of sometimes we have to laugh a little bit, a few of the factors that go into this. He's saying, okay, now on 3, I'm going to toss a second job in there. And I know that many of the women professionals in our world have multiple roles at work, multiple roles at home, and that there are often many tensions among those roles. And yet, these are the manageable tensions, the role conflicts. This is how women learn how to delegate and to when they can afford it, to buy the help that they need. The harder kind of challenges are these, the perceptual challenges. A recent study has found that even at the Supreme Court, the women justices are interrupted more often than the men justices. So this challenge, if it's hard enough to get a seat at the table, and then how one develops that credible voice, overcomes that protective hesitation, and then still being prepared to not get as much credit for one's ideas, no wonder women's leadership potential remains underestimated. And then we have this challenge of how strong behaviors are evaluated differently between men and women. Some of you may have heard the term resting bitch face. There were a whole bunch of photos of women celebrities looking angry because they didn't have a smile on their face. And since many, if not most, women scientists are analytic introverts, and there's a tendency for analytic introverts of both sexes to when they're just working or thinking to not have a smile on their face. Women have to be aware that that lack of smile may be interpreted as anger. One colleague of mine got really negative feedback that she looked angry all the time, and I just suggested that she put just a slight smile on her face as she walked down the hall or was in the elevator. And I asked her when I saw her again, is that making a difference? And she said, I feel like I have a smile pasted on my face, but people are greeting me and they're saying hello, and so it made that just little behavioral change for her made a difference in how likable she appeared. So I'm not going to read my slides. I'm going to be giving you a number of observations about these questions that we're talking about. So nobody thinks they're unfair. Nobody believes that they're biased. As Reshma said, we don't wake up in the morning thinking how we're going to be unfair. And one of the great resources that has been published in the last few years is this work by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. Has anyone read this book? I highly recommend this distillation of studies that help us appreciate how the human brain perceives and comes to conclusions. So here are some of his observations. So his recommendation from looking at all the studies he could find about this is that in order to be accurate evaluators, we have to slow down. And we have to be aware of when these biases that are built into the brain may be interfering. And we have to obviously be able to discuss this with each other, to discuss what we're perceiving. And that's one of the biggest challenges, is that how do we make time for this? How do we slow down in order to improve the accuracy of our ability to develop talent? And we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a minute, but also I wanted to then come back to what are some of the other aspects of this challenge that we're facing. What are we learning? One of the most useful observations I found from Sheryl Sandberg's helpful book, Lean In, is the tiara syndrome, which many young women assume still that if they work hard, they will be rewarded. And one of the main observations that young faculty have when they come on is they all of a sudden realize that hard work and talent aren't enough, that organizational savvy and negotiating skills are critical. How do we help young women learn this? Well, this is one of the kinds of symposium that I think can be so helpful in that regard, because the more men and women understand the ubiquity and the tenacity of some of these assumptions and expectations, the more educated we are, the more accurately and effectively we can have discussions of them and then counteract them. And at the same time, it's really challenging to focus on gender, because there are so many tripwires. Similarly with talking about other kinds of differences, particularly racial differences. It's difficult to talk about something so sensitive and so personal and yet so systemic. We still lack a language. As I mentioned, nobody believes that they're unfair. So how do we talk about bias? And having some patience with that, appreciating that even though we're far into the next century, we're still needing to work on and find a language to talk about these questions is critical. That is not to expect that it should all be solved, because these are such long-standing challenges. And that is also part of, and this is a bigger question than for this group, but I want to raise it. What metric do we use? I certainly couldn't have imagined what many young women today take for granted in terms of access to equal opportunity. And yet, we still face all these challenges. So even finding a metric is challenging. But one of the insights that has become so clear in the last couple decades is that what we're talking about are systems levels issue. They're not just women's issues. I never, in all those years at the AAMC of trying to create programs that would help women realize their career potentials, use the term women's issues, because these are our issues. These are all systems issues we're talking about. Another kind of dark corner that's hard to talk about is the ways that women hamper each other. And we won't have time to go into that today, but I recommend the article that I finally wrote about the subject, since every time I have spoken about gender, it seems as if someone raises the very good and sensitive question about why do women hamper each other so much. So, do any of these sound familiar to you? I know many of you have your own examples. I could have put 100 others. So that's, now I want to spend the last 15 minutes of my time looking more at what do we do about this? How can women be perceived both as strong and likable? And so I want to be talking more about what it means to be a more versatile and relational communicator, how we build capacity for conflict. And the core, I would say, of being a leader, of being an effective professional is being able to differentiate what you can influence and what you can't influence, both in your own work and life and in the bigger system that you live in. And then learning from the many disappointments that you will have, that we will have, rather than repetitive rumination, which turns into chaotic overthinking, which turns into cynicism and resentments, and we can't afford living in a state of righteous indignation, although many of us could. I mean, we notice 100 things before breakfast is over that we can be righteously indignant about, but that doesn't get us anywhere. In fact, I heard a department chair say one time that he times himself. When he feels himself getting righteously indignant, he allows himself 5 minutes a day, and that's it. And once he started to become aware of how many minutes he was wasting, he was able to bring that down to almost less than 1 minute. So, actually, this reminds me of the fact that, or the observation that academic medicine is like the obverse of an old Western saloon in which people had to check their guns at the door. In academics, people are allowed to take their guns to work, but they have to check their personhood at the door. It's pretty negative, and I know it can feel like this sometimes, and it can feel like this sometimes, but we can't afford to get stuck at the wall. We have to get better at handling conflicts. And of course, this goes for everybody, but because of what we know about the extra challenges that women face, women have to get even better at this. And so just being able to reframe conflict as a differing interest with someone can help take down that wall a little bit. And always disagreements are opportunities to learn about the system and how other people think and what's holding this in place and why would a reasonable person think that and how can I bridge to that person. And the ability to question our assumptions, that's one of the big richnesses of the Daniel Kahneman book is we can all get better at this and recognizing when your own storyline, when your own narrative, how you're connecting the dots. Or have you become the victim or the hero or the martyr in your story or all three at once, and where does that get you? in order to become a more objective evaluator of what's going on. And versatility as a communicator. There's no such thing as I gotta be me. And it's not about inauthenticity. It's about appreciating when it would be helpful to slow down your voice or ramp it up or tone it down, when to be a more analytic communicator, when it's okay to lead with your heart. It's those kind of perceptions of what does this situation require? How can I be more persuasive? How can I be a better learner in this situation? And so this is what I mean by relational communication skills. And this is the heart of everything, of negotiating, of delegating, of building relationships with your boss, your peers, your direct reports, because everything gets done through people. And so relationship it's so obvious that it almost doesn't need to be stated. But there's many layers of relational communication skills, and I feel as if these are lifelong skills, that I'll be learning about how to get better at these to the end of my days. I read not long ago that one of the ways in which women's amygdala are more easily triggered than men's by negative events. And so the negative emotions are closer to the surface. And so it's even more important to become really good at detecting, and usually we get our first clues from our bodies of when the anger or the frustration or a negative emotion may be arising that can hijack you. And just getting better at better. So the adrenaline doesn't need to build up a full head of steam before you're able to walk yourself back down to what hooked me and what do I want to happen next, rather than to allow the anger to take over. And what I mean by inquiry is this. Being able to ask a question that can lead to dialogue, I have found, is one of the most important skills in the world. For one thing, especially if we're feeling a sense of frustration in a situation, in a conversation or a conflict, our tendency is to become self-protective. And then you end up with two sets of defenses talking to each other, and there's no opportunity for dialogue. So when we sense that self-protectiveness arising, put your energy into what question can I ask that might diffuse the situation and help me learn more about how this other person is thinking. And then the ability to listen in a generative, patient way. Listening is actually an advanced communication skill. We all think we're good at it, but it takes work. And not all conversations is this kind of listening necessary. Most clinicians and scientists we're trained to think automatically because you have to sort constantly through lots of information. It's knowing when you need to slow down and listen more generatively. And I understand that the Chinese symbol for listening is not just the ear, it's also the eye, because we take in so much information about people from the way they're reacting and what has happening in their body, and also an open mind and an open heart. So it turns out to be a really complex skill, and we can all get better at it. So this is what it looks like to combine that skill of asking questions with a skill in advocating and putting one's ideas on the table in order to advance mutual learning, which is usually what we're trying to do in creating and building relationships and in trying to resolve conflicts and in negotiating, all those key career skill areas. And then often the most important conversations that we have starts in ourselves because we choose what to focus on, right? So these are good questions to be asking. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead a bit. Oh, okay. Well, this is good. So, a few years ago, trying to appeal to the competitive instincts of men, I decided to put together a bunch of observations about how men can excel as mentors of women, appreciating that most men don't have as great a track record in mentoring their women proteges as they do men. And so here are some of the observations that I proposed. And something that we can all get better at, and why these relational skills I've been trying to describe to you in very short time are so critical, are the issues that we're observing about the continuing difference in the way that men and women as leaders, as sources of talent, are perceived, as we need to be able to raise these kind of delicate questions. And lots of other delicate questions in our world today. And so it's a matter of skill, it's a matter of courage, it's finding role models, observing how people who have gotten good at this, unfortunately, your world is rich in leaders who are skilled communicators, observing how did you get good at this, at responding to challenging issues and raising challenging issues. And it's a form of mentoring that we're doing with each other, of encouraging a more accurate and acute appreciation of talent development and how we can together create more fair processes. And my observation of what practices do improve gender diversity are summarized here. And I know a lot of these have been underway here for quite a number of years. And I believe it's one of the reasons why your institution remains so strong in so many ways. And yet, as you have heard, as we have observed today, there's still a lot more work to do. And I'm really excited about the opportunity that the rest of the morning and early afternoon presents in order to pool our understanding and our observations and our hopes and our strategies for what we can continue to do better together. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
So I really am glad that we were able to start this day off with a discussion of kind of really the data surrounding this topic, both appreciating talks from Dr. Juxi and Janet Bickel on the topic. We are ready to move into our panel, but let me introduce myself briefly. So I'm Durga Singer, so Dr. Feldman introduced me at the beginning here. I'm an assistant professor in pediatric endocrinology, and I'm also a Taubman Emerging Scholar, which is, I think, what gives me the honor of being able to moderate this panel today. So I would like if all our panelists could come up to the stage here. I think Dr. Pinsky might have had to step out. So I could read and introduce everyone that's here, but their CVs and accomplishments are so large that I would really be up here for the whole hour and a half probably just introducing them. So just in order that it looks like everyone sat down, I have Dr. Eva Feldman, Dr. Lori McCauley, Dr. Valerie Opapari, Dr. David Pinsky, Dr. Reshma Jagsi, Dr. Carol Bradford, Dr. David Brown, and Janet Bickel. So the main goal that I have for this panel is it actually to be more of a conversation. This group could really talk a lot about their expertise in this area, but we also want to emphasize some of the issues that people are feeling at Michigan Medicine and try to understand what are the goals and actions of our leaders in order to fill some of these gaps. So I really do want it to be a discussion, so we do have 2 microphones in the back, and I really would love if people would kind of come up to those microphones if you have questions so that you can ask kind of what you're thinking about. I have a couple of prepared questions in mind, but if you'd like, do you want to bring the microphones down more, maybe, Stacy, so people can kind of get to them easier? I'm just going to start off with a question, though, because, do you want to go ahead and start off with your question? Go ahead. It's okay.
So no, I was just going to commend the speakers. I thought they did a fantastic job. I did have a question directed a little bit more for Reshma, but anybody can chime in. So I thought this was excellent, and I've attended several of these before, but what I'm always disappointed in is when I look at the audience, it's primarily women, and it's usually short on leaders as well. And so how is there going to be change when it's a grassroots sort of bottom-up effort? And can you kind of comment on, how do we get more leadership involved, and how do we get more men involved in this issue? Because I agree that it's a systems issue, not a women's issue.
Thanks, Megan. Completely agree with you. I feel that often I'm speaking within the echo chamber, that there's a lot of nodding from individuals who've had the same experiences and who already know what the data show and are pleased to see the data that reinforces what they've already experienced. What I do think is really unique about this symposium that Dr. Feldman convened is that there's a number of our institution's leaders sitting up here on this panel with me, and so we do have important department chairs who are in the audience, both male and female. So I think this is, for groups that I speak to on these topics, actually a pretty mixed group, so I'm pleased by that. I also think that we have an opportunity by having more junior folks involved to harness that energy to make important changes for the institution as a whole, so this actually can be a leadership opportunity itself. And I think that that's the real hope with this symposium, is to actually generate ideas that can then be taken forward through small working groups of individuals who can then actually connect to and get to know the leaders that are sitting here next to me. And so I think this could itself be an opportunity for change.
So I think that's a great question. I think that this is a journey. I don't think that there are easy solutions, but I do think that I and everybody up here on the stage and all of you are deeply committed to changing the paradigm. The data remain compelling that we are not making sufficient change. And so a lot of Janet's action items are things that are actually happening in our organization right now. I have the privilege of serving Michigan Medicine as the Executive Vice Dean for Academic Affairs. So I am asking our chairs about recruitments, who's joining their organization. We certainly know about promotions because I co-chair the executive committee. Reshma also serves on that committee. And importantly, who is departing our organization, who has left. And I think that that can be very insightful information and a symptom of, it's not the solution, but it makes a case for change. I really do appreciate deep engagement of all of our chairs in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they are all asked about that and inform me what they're doing in the annual performance review. And I also want to tip my hat to Michigan Medicine's efforts in faculty development and leadership development. Some programs are about women's issues, like the annual Leadership Summit for Women, the Rudy Ansbacher Leadership Development Programs, but they're really for all faculty and developing the skill set for all faculty. R01 Boot Camp, that K to R transition is a critical step in the life of an academic faculty member, so I encourage participation in that. And then finally, sponsorship. So David can talk a bit more about a program. Sonia Jacobs, who is or was here, Margaret Yetko, who is our Senior Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs, is on her way to Scotland today for a vacation, otherwise she'd be in the audience. But sponsorship and educating both sponsors and what they call proteges on how to build an effective sponsorship relationship, which is different from mentorship. That is really helping sponsors help proteges find those opportunities, those building blocks that are essential to ultimate success, like serving on editorial boards and serving on local, regional, and national committees, so that people see your face and then advocate for you in leadership opportunities.
I wonder if, David Brown, if you could comment about some of the initiatives that are directly coming out of your office, from the Office of Health, Equity, and Inclusion, really to promote kind of our leaders getting educated to kind of come to the table, but also helping kind of across the university with some of these issues.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to also just respond to a little bit what Dr. Bradford talked about and what the question earlier asked about more men being involved. And I'm one of the few men who has in the past helped organize the Women's Academic Medicine Leadership Conference, and very few men have attended. And we've noticed that, and we've been talking about that recently, about how do we get more men involved. In fact, the 4 men who were there last time all loved it, and it was eye-opening for them. And so we really need to encourage the men and women leaders to attend this. So this is on our brains. And what Dr. Bradford talked about with Sponsor Ready, a few of you might have gone to the Women's Leadership Summit a year ago, where Sylviane Hewlett came, and she was the author of the book, Forget a Mentor, Get a Sponsor. And so she has this program called Sponsor Ready, which is more in the business world, but we're the first academic medical center that's piloting that right now. And we're teaching women and people of color how to be proteges so that they could find a sponsor. And then we're also going to have to teach the sponsors how to recognize and be outstanding sponsors. If it weren't for my sponsor, I wouldn't be sitting here today. I would have never even known where Michigan was. I would probably still be on the East Coast somewhere. So I'm very fortunate, and I know the value of having a sponsor. Other things we're doing, so as you know, many of you know that there's a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan, and our office is working with everyone. We're not the only doers. We really need everyone to work with this. We started with the unconscious bias training, and I believe we're getting numbers close to 5,000 people at the Academic Medical Center alone. And what we found is, with some of our data, because we analyzed most of the sessions, is that when you do it in a group that works together, it's actually more meaningful. So we're trying, and we're switching from having drop-ins as many to more working with groups, so you can figure out what diversity initiatives do you need to work on in your group. And that's an opportunity for women, people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQ to speak up and say, we need to make sure that we're doing these things as well.
Jen, do you want to comment on that as well?
One brief comment. When I have an opportunity to design a program, I don't use the word women or gender anywhere in the program. I make it about talent development or some other skill we all want to get better at. And then I talk about what we've been talking about are the differences between men and women's experiences. And that usually gets men in the room, and we can slip in the other stuff.
So it looks like we have another question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks for doing this. I think it's a great opportunity. I'm Beth Moore. I'm a professor in medicine. And I just have a couple of comments and then a question. My first comment is that by far the best mentor and sponsor I ever had was a man. So it definitely is possible, and I'm very appreciative of that. My second comment was just about Daniel Kahneman's book. One point you didn't make that I thought was really interesting in that book was this idea of the expert fallacy. And it was this concept that the more we know about our subject matter, the more likely we are to jump to these assumptions that we can choose the best candidate. We know what an academic pulmonary researcher should look like, so I can pick which CV is going to be the most appropriate because I just know that, and how wrong that is. So I just wanted to bring that concept up. But based on Reshma's data, I was really excited or interested to see that it seems like it's the research time and the academic focus that's where the squeeze happens the most. So my question to the panel is just, is there anything at the leadership level or in your departments or divisions that you're doing to try to provide more support, more resources for the research aspect, whatever your academic pursuits are? Because it seems like that's really where the squeeze is happening, and I just wondered about that.
So,
Yeah.
so I feel compelled to, before I answer that question, say something about the first question and actually say something to Rashmi. So your conclusion slide, I would like you to change the very first bullet where you said, we have made substantial stride. Get rid of the word substantial. We have not made substantial stride, and it is not good that there isn't broad representation from our male colleagues in this audience, and I think it is incumbent upon our leadership to not be happy with the status quo. And now I'll answer your question, I think. I'll try. And I'm also cognizant of Janet's comments about making sure you keep your anger, right? So I am blessed by being the chair of the Department of Pediatrics and the very first woman appointed as a chair at the University of Michigan Medical School. And that was in 2003. So I would say that every day that I go to work, I'm thinking about how I can use all the things that I experienced in my career to make it better for everybody that depends on me. But sorry for the few males in the audience, in particular for the women. Because I do think there are many things that inhibit their ability to be successful, real, biased, unknown, I mean, I could go on. And so I think our job and my job as a chair with my division chiefs who also know we're going through annual review right now, and one of the things that we talk about out of the gate, are there any equity issues? Are there any issues around not providing what is needed for an individual? And that's what we have to address, because I believe that it is incumbent on all of us to try and identify those resources. So there are many approaches that we take. They're different for every individual. We have some faculty that need additional time with modified duties. There are some faculty that need additional resources. They need additional time. They need requests for time off the clock. There are a myriad of things. But I think as a chair, and I'm sure as a dean, I think Lori should probably speak next, and as a division chief, it is our responsibility to understand deeply the barriers and to find whatever resources we can to help overcome those barriers so that our faculty, all of our faculty can be successful, but in particular that we're raising the boats of women.
Yeah, actually, Dr. McCauley, as dean of a dental school, can you speak to what's going on in your own departments?
Well, I'll just start and say that I realized that I was actually quite privileged when in dental school there was 15% of my class that were women, and one of my classmates made it clear to me that the women had a strong advantage in dental school because we didn't have the compulsion to have to watch football all day on Saturday. And that we could study more, and that was serious. But I actually had the good fortune to have a female mentor when I came to Michigan, who was a department chair, and at the time was the only female department chair in the STEM fields, I believe, on this campus. And she started in 1990, and she was not only an outstanding mentor, role model, and sponsor to me, and it still serves in all of those roles today. She went on to become the dean of the dental school at Washington and is now a director of one of the institutes at NIH. And as a role model, I have to say that when I looked to, when I was, going crazy because I was submitting my first R01 and trying to teach and do clinical work, and thought, maybe I should go and ask her for some help or relief. She had 2 R01s and was department chair and was, doing all these things and was incredibly supportive to me as well. So I think what Val mentioned about having an individual approach is really key. It's really knowing your faculty, knowing the strengths of the faculty, knowing the areas where they could use assistance and help, whether it be in resources for their research, in time outside of teaching to focus on their research, but really getting to know the faculty on an individual basis to be able to support them. One of the things that we have done, for instance, that helps all faculty, but I think you might see that it particularly could help female faculty, is we put funds in to support junior faculty to invite prominent individuals in their field to come to campus. And when they come to campus, they can either come just to give a presentation. It could be that they come to teach a technique in the laboratory. It could be that they're coming because they're an outstanding clinician. But the key is that obviously there are some faculty who are more flexible in their ability to travel to meetings, to network, and others who may not be as flexible. And so it provides them an opportunity to link with somebody who could be, writing a promotion letter for them at some point in time. It could be someone who opens a door in their specific field to them, as well as it shows off our school, and I think is good in general for uplifting the caliber of our unit.
Great. That's a great suggestion. Did you want to comment on that, Dr. Piski?
I just want to comment. First of all, I very much agree with what you said. And just to point out, we're sitting a little bit in a row, a chief, a chair, and a dean. and so I want to comment on the perspective of what you said, Dr. McCauley, about knowing your faculty. And I think the smaller the functional unit, probably the easier it is to know your faculty. And Department of Medicine, I think, now has 850 faculty, so it relies on divisions. And so knowing the faculty is really important because it's not a cookie cutter approach. So to answer Dr. Moore's question, we've had women faculty who need a little bit of statistical support because their time is so fractionated in many ways, and that can help with the paper. Somebody might need a schedule adjustment because of other duties. And so I think the more we dive down to a functional unit where you can know your faculty, the easier it is to actually transact a supportive strategy.
So we have a question over here.
Yes, I do. So, hi, I'm from the Department of Pathology. I do have one question, which is we've been talking consistently about how important it is to have a mentor or sponsor, and I don't think anybody really succeeds in their career without having that. But traditionally, being a good mentor is not valued in academic centers. And so I want to know, are there any plans to include that, to measure it, to put it in the promotions process, for example? Because I do think, the more you value it, the more interest you'll have in people being a good mentor. I was at a mentoring workshop just recently, and there was another member there who was basically like, I'm here because I'm highly motivated, but this isn't the type of thing I can put on my CV. So I'm just wondering, are there any plans to do that?
So thank you for that question. I think that mentorship, sponsorship, and coaching are all really important, and I think that they are and should be valued in our organization by faculty and staff in general, by division chiefs, chairs, and deans. I can tell you when I was department chair, and I was the fourth female department chair at Michigan Medicine, and I was appointed in January of 2009, so there were a few in between, Valerie and I, two to be exact. So I asked about it. So I think that there's a difference between what are criteria for promotion and what are good things we should do. So I would put mentorship, so if you turn, the work Reshma has done in highlighting these issues are clearly scholarly work, and so then it becomes a criteria for promotion. But I think it's really, so I asked every faculty member who did they mentor, like who were their mentees, and who mentored them. So both who mentored them and who were their mentors. And so that created for me sort of a mentorship grid. If anybody had blanks in those in the self-evaluation process, I encourage them to both be mentors and to serve as mentors. I would probably change that today and add in sponsors and coaches as well, which play unique roles. I think the reality is that it's really about our values and what we value. Now, does that mean that, we have to fund initiatives or make them criteria for promotion? I know time is challenging, and so we all have a million duties. But I can tell you personally, not a day goes by where somebody doesn't reach out to me here or in Southern California to say, I need your advice, I need your strategy, and my email this morning is 4 pretty great questions about potentially being a chair somewhere, and it's like, compensation and incentive programs. So it's not something I could answer in an email, but I said I'm booked all day till 7:30. Call me anytime after 7:30. So I think the reality is we all need to commit to do those important things. Now, it does matter for promotion in what I would call your teaching portfolio. So for learners, mentorship absolutely should, and awards relating to teaching and mentorship should be part of your package and an important part of your package. And I think, I would also say our committees, we try to take a holistic view of the contributions of a faculty member. But the reality is currently other things are measured for criteria for promotion on the various tracks. But I personally take a holistic view of the individual faculty member, and the committee does, in looking at the sum total of their contributions. And every single CV does list who that faculty member mentored. And it is an absolutely important criteria that we look at. It's just not the only criteria.
Can I ask a question? So a lot of the numbers that we've seen today are pretty depressing, right? And I recently got appointed, or not appointed, but I recently joined the Diversity and Inclusion subcommittee in my department. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about is whether there are any examples out there that we can turn to that have had success. So we've kind of talked about the medical field in general and the numbers being dismal, but are there any universities, medical colleges, departments that are shining examples for how you should do this? And if there are, what were the best strategies, what were the strategies that they pointed to that helped them?
Well, I may give you a sort of depressing answer. No. So no one has found the answer on a global scale. In fact, when we go to national meetings, at least for diversity that includes women and underrepresented minorities, a lot of people look to Michigan. They think that we're doing a great job. Internally, we feel that we're not doing a great job. I think that if there is a bell curve, everyone's off to the left, and so there isn't a nice even distribution. We may be slightly to the right on some things, but I think that no one's figured out the answer. I do have some answers for gender. I do think that having women in leadership positions, when Dr. Bradford became the chair of, I'm an otolaryngologist as well, of the Department of Otolaryngology, in our residency program, we had gender parity. We have 50% women in our residency program, and the national average is more on the order of 30%. And we have a lot of women faculty. I don't know our numbers compared to the national average, but I know that having a woman in leadership position is really important.
And one would assume that we would have some standard best practices for how to approach these issues. And my experience is along the lines of David's, is that one of the reasons why I think we don't have like a model to follow is that each institution and each department within each institution has its own history, its own culture, its own leadership challenges and opportunities, and so much of it, of what progress can be made, is about the individuals within any group that's trying to get better at this. And so the commonality, I think, what we're talking about is seeking to empower all individuals within the group to work together for what our goals are. What does talent development, what does excellence look like? And continue
I know that
to
Dr.
work.
Pinsky was waiting to kind of say something, so I just wanted to give him an opportunity as well. Were you? Oh, okay.
Oh, I was going to make a very brief comment, and that is, I think I don't have all the answers, but I actually think the first important step is to have conversations. This is a conversation. You should have conversations. And my other observation, having probably pushed the envelope for my entire career, is you know that you're beginning to have the right conversations. And I'm not meaning even locally, but regionally and nationally and internationally, when you start to get real pushback and people sort of saying, you know, I did an unconscious bias panel and we had phone voting, and 2 PhDs spoke it's hard to deny that we do, the evidence is very strong that unconscious bias does exist. For good reasons, it does exist. And the whole strategy is understanding your implicit or unconscious bias. And so we had a phone audience response curve. And this didn't have women on the title, so it was half men and women in the audience. And then we asked the question of the audience, do you have unconscious bias, or do you think you have unconscious bias? And it was 10 or 20% that said no. And it was it's fascinating. So you want to begin to have the conversations, and then, in my view, that's local, one-on-one, small group, and then change really happens. But I think knowledge always precedes change.
And just briefly, I think we have to take some credit in what's going on here. I mean, I felt quite fortunate when I started as dean that the university efforts on diversity, equity, and inclusion were really just scaling up. And I just felt like it was just such a convergence of, you know, what I wanted to do, and then to have this as just being incredibly strong from the president and the university. I think that combination, I'm cautiously optimistic that, you know, there's a lot of really great things that we will do here, and we will be the exemplar.
Take your question.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about women in leadership, and I really appreciate all of the panelists and everything you've had to say. And I'm a research staff in the Department of Learning Health Sciences in the med school. And one of the things that's been difficult for me as someone who hopes to pursue a PhD and a career in academia is that even at the staff level, there's disparities. So all of the women in my department are mostly administrators, and there's a bunch of technicians and software developers who are all men. And so as someone who wants to pursue academia further, I wondered how can I move forward when even at the staff level, I'm seeing the same sort of disparities. So it feels really hard to pursue further if the disparities happen at every level.
I don't know the answer, but I can give an analogy, which is a story. So I'm a head and neck cancer surgeon, and so there were a few women that were in otolaryngology, head and neck surgery residence in front of me, but by the time I entered residency, there were no other women in the training program. I joined the faculty in 1992, and my first all faculty dinner, I was the only woman there. And so the point is that, go for it. Pursue your passions, pursue your dreams, find mentors, sponsors, and coaches. ELAM taught me something along the way. You know, women don't ask, and we do not promote ourselves. And so ELAM, which is Executive Leadership in Academic Medicine, which is another great leadership development program that Janet co-founded with Paige Morahan, is called graceful self-promotion. So we don't boast, don't be arrogant, but it's okay. So I love the word graceful self-promotion. So go for it. Somebody's, may as well be you, right?
Yeah, and I think one thing to emphasize about that is that there are initiatives in departments, so I'll ask Dr. Pinsky and Dr. Opapari to speak about that, but there's also within the medical school committees focused on both staff as well as faculty development and equity kind of in leadership positions for the staff as well. So there are definitely mentors that you could find out there, and we can kind of help connect you to those so that you can kind of have role models to follow through with on that. Dr. Pinsky?
So I think what you're bringing up is a very important point. In the Cardiovascular Center just a few weeks ago, we had one in a series of groups, working groups. It was called the Joy in Work working group, and it was staff, it was faculty, it was nursing, it was everybody. We actually sat in a round circle introducing ourselves, and the outcome of that was that everybody needs a mentor. Doesn't matter where you are in the organization. I need a mentor in my role. I sometimes turn outside the organization, but everybody needs a mentor. And at the end, our task for the Cardiovascular Center staff, as well as faculty and other members of the team, everybody had to find a mentor. And after that, there were a bunch of requests for mentorship. And mentorship can cross levels. It doesn't have to be staff mentoring staff. It can be faculty mentoring staff or staff mentoring faculty. To be honest, it can go both ways. But I think asking for mentorship is a first step. Seeking that out, and you'll find more receptivity than you might imagine.
And I'll just add, I perhaps have the widest hair in the room, but in my experience, in my early experience, there's no such thing as a level playing field, and each of us is the CEO of our own career, and so you get to decide what to focus on, and if you focus on the disparity, that might actually end up increasing the disparity, and so I agree. Go for it.
So I just want to emphasize that point, but we can help. So in our department, the efforts that we have for the faculty are equivalent to the things that we're trying to do on the staff level, because building diverse communities where every voice is heard is critical to any successful organization. So you had the strength to come and ask the question, and afterwards, I'd like to know what your email address is, because I actually know your chair, and I would be happy to send a little message about how wonderful your question was. Yeah. And this gives me a chance to say what, again, I think is everyone that serves as a leader in an organization, when you see an opportunity, seize it and grab it. And as a chair or a division chief or a wonderful investigator, when I get messages just like Dr. Bradford, I don't just put them in a shelf and say, well, I can't help you with that. I don't know. I try to see what it is I can do, because my God, we're all part of an organization and we want everybody to succeed. So I want to know what your email address is.
Okay, I'll let you know. Thank you.
Dr. Wallach?
And I will just follow that up by saying that she's absolutely spot on when she says that, because I just reached out to Val this week to help with a fabulous female faculty member we have whose spouse needs a position, and she responded very quickly and very helpful to me. So she will do that for you.
I like to ask a question that's related to a lot of the conversations that have happened here today in terms of a jumping off point and engagement and how to get people more engaged. And it's great to have a lot of people here, largely female, and perhaps a lot of junior people too. But do you think it's important to have these discussions in places where there actually is more of the roadblock, like at Arbor, where there's 3 of 29, I think, department chairs that are female, or my own department as an example, where 13 of the 13 division chiefs are male. That I know there's a lot of really important things that have to happen at meetings at that level, but that perhaps sort of forced discussion around these issues might also be part of solving the problem, as opposed to people who choose to be engaged voluntarily.
Let me address that just briefly. One of the goals of today is, after we have this group meeting, we've got a smaller set of focus groups of 80 individuals, with the idea that we're going to have clear deliverables from today, with clear messages from today that will go to leadership. So that will go to our deans, who are sitting here, but also our division chiefs and our department chairs. So I hope as a first step, this conversation, as Carol said, is the first conversation of many, but the content of this conversation is not going to end when we all leave this room at 11 o'clock, but rather it's going to be carried forward we have a plan in a very systematic way, because I think your question is spot on. We don't want to leave this room at 11 o'clock, and we've had a good time, and we're all, more self-aware. We started a conversation. We're really going to continue that conversation for this group.
And one thing I wanted to mention is that we're unveiling a new toolkit, a faculty search committee toolkit, which is already done and it's been approved by legal, but we're getting it online to make it user-friendly, and it should be up and running by July 1st. I worked closely with Margaret Yecko from faculty development and other women leaders and people from diverse backgrounds, including chairs and division chiefs, to put this together. And the goal is to increase diversity for women and people of color of the ranks of division chief and higher. So it's a requirement for division chief and higher, and ultimately we'll go lower potentially. There are some things that need to be done, like we're starting out with at least a third have to do the STRIDE unconscious bias training. The reason why I picked a third is because we know 38% is the tipping point. Ultimately, we want to get to 100%, but right now we don't have the capacity. If we said 100%, we'd get all these requests and we wouldn't be able to accommodate, but ultimately 100%. Behavior-based interview questions, inclusive announcements, what questions are legal, illegal, things to talk or not talk about at dinner, so that you don't just talk about the hockey match that you saw last night, because I hear both sides. I hear, well, we really wanted this woman and she didn't come. We thought she was awesome, and I talked to her. It just says, they didn't include me in the conversation. We talked about hockey all night, and I'm not into hockey. So this best practice, we hope, will be useful for increasing diversity for the division chief on up.
Since we have a lineup with the mics, we'll just go to the next question.
So could I just make a follow-up comment? So I think it's great to make recommendations. So how do we make it actually happen? And so we will measure this, and it is a planned inclusion in our academic medical center-wide goals that all senior leaders are measured and evaluated by. So that makes it an institutional-wide goal.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kristen Willer. I'm an associate professor in cardiovascular medicine. So I just want to thank all of you. This is a wonderful forum, wonderful opportunity, especially my chief who's here. So I want to say something kind of provocative. I realize there's issues in terms of bias and pay and equity for the people who are here, but I think the bigger problem is all the people who are not here, the huge attrition that we see from women who get MDs, PhDs, do postdocs, and we lose them somewhere along the way. And I honestly think the elephant in the room is it's just so hard to juggle having a family and having this intense career. We're talking about a model, but I feel like the model we're living in is a bit of a relic from a time that was basically built around men who had stay-home wives. And I think change needs to be even bigger. There's a lot that we expect out of women who, when they're going up for promotion, which thankfully I went through last year, that's really, really hard. I have 5 kids, and it's really, really hard for me to travel. If you can imagine what it would take for me to bring 5 kids and my nanny, paying for a hotel room downtown San Diego for 5 days, or the amount of logistics I have to go through to leave my kids for 5 days. How do I juggle being competitive with men who have stay-home wives in terms of getting grant funding, writing papers, and still make my kids' preschool graduation, which is today at 10:30, and I'm sorry I have to leave early. Honestly, it's really hard. Some of my mentors who have been fantastic say it's like swimming with 10-pound weights, and sometimes it feels like swimming with 100-pound weights. So I guess my question or challenge to you is, how do we develop a world for our daughters that allows them to compete and be strong scientists while still allowing them to do what they want to do in terms of raising a family and being the kind of mother that they want to be? I'm sorry, it's a hard question.
I really appreciate that question, and I think that many of our faculty up here could speak to work-life integration as well as kind of what maybe initiatives are going on outside of our university, if Dr. Jexi and Janet Bickle would also speak about that. But we'll start with Dr. Opapari on the question.
So first of all, you, 5 children, got promoted with tenure, you did it. You have skill sets and understandings that can be helpful to many people in this room because you've done it. So I, too, had 4 children. I would have liked to have had 6, but 4. And I'm so glad the word has changed from work-life balance to work-life integration. I'm not even sure I like integration. There's nothing about balance or integration in what you accomplished, right? And so I think one important message for everybody to hear is that it can be done. It is difficult, but sometimes some of us choose difficult paths, and that's okay. But again, the people around you supporting you, both at your home, within your family, I would imagine your children have been a huge support to you in accomplishing your goals. My children were a huge support to me. And the community that you live in your department and in your division, there are probably, I guess if you sat down, you'd probably come up with the name of about, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 individuals that kept encouraging you, giving you the kind of stamina you needed, and that you yourself had the kind of skill sets, being organized, learning when to worry about, what to worry about. So for those of you in the audience, not everybody chooses that career path. But if you choose that career path and that life path, it can be done, but it's a lot of hard work, and you need a lot of supports around you. And I would encourage all of you to read an opinion piece by Janet Gilsdorf, who's a very accomplished emeritus faculty in the Department of Pediatrics. It was in JAMA last year. It's called The Good Enough Parent, because she too walked that road. She was the only woman in her med school. She was told she couldn't do a lot of things. She became a tenured professor, one of the first here at the University of Michigan. And she talks about the fact that I made life choices and I was a good enough parent, right? And I think one of the things that those of us that have walked that journey often do is we're hardest on ourselves. My guess is you were probably at times very hard on yourself, that you weren't good enough. And that's why you need that support system around you to tell you you are good enough and you can do it. But it is a lot of hard work, and it's not balanced, and it's not usually integrated, but it is what it is.
Dr. Pinsky?
Can I just make a comment? First of all, just because, just to acknowledge what you've accomplished is remarkable, independent of your gender. It is remarkable. So hats off to you. But I'm also learning, having us here, hearing, and in our various venues, lets us learn. So I just learned something in this conversation because there's a piece of advice I give to people because I meet with people. And one of the pieces of advice is to get promoted, you got to go out on the road and you got to go to all these different academic institutions and you have to network. We can help you, maybe introduce you if you don't know people or how to get invited, but you got to go on the road. What I'm hearing now is maybe that's not a gender-sensitive strategy. For instance, if you're a working mother, maybe that isn't, maybe Dr. McCauley's approach of having faculty invite people to do at-home networking, because that's equal networking. But so I think these conversations will help tune leadership for really subtle, sensitive points which until this minute I never realized might really change how certain people can go out on the road.
And so also to speak a little bit about what's going on at the national level, so a colleague of mine did a sort of an informal poll of barriers to attending the American Society of Clinical Oncology, which is the big 40,000 person meeting that I just attended. And she was very concerned that many of her peers were not attending this important networking opportunity because of limitations related to childrearing. And so I think there's several things we can do as a field. So one is providing on-site accessible childcare. I mean, 40,000 attendees. We could probably have some on-site. So we now have a women's networking center there. I'm now on the board of directors. I'm going to try to get us childcare, and I actually used part of my remaining startup funds, and I actually contacted her when I saw her thing. I didn't realize she was a radiation oncologist, my weird specialty, and she's a new junior faculty member, and I said, do you want me to fund you to do a real survey? Because she said, I can't get it published anywhere. And I said, well, no, because it was a poll. But the questions you wrote are great. Let's get a real sample. Let's get a generalizable sample. And I'll pay for it. Don't tell my chair I spent my startup on this. But it's discretionary, and it's really important, right? He'd be proud of that. And there are also opportunities like the advanced program here that does have the Crosby Fund, so I have the privilege of serving on that review committee, where it's certainly not adequate to send you to every meeting that you need to go to, but women can actually articulate a need to go to a professional society meeting with the nanny and the 5 kids and the hotel room in San Diego and actually get financial support for that. So I think that's really important for people in this audience to know. And then the last thing I want to say is on a personal note, I do think we're too hard on ourselves. So I am constantly away because I just travel and leave my kids behind, and I'm a terrible mother. And I feel horrible about this, right? And I showed up to take my son to piano on Monday after having been at ASCO for 5 days. I came back the day before it ended. It goes through Tuesday, but I came back on Monday night to take him to piano. Just got elected to the board of directors because of sponsorship, because the ASCO president was here, and I'm now on the board of directors. Big freaking deal. I needed to go to the meeting. Came back feeling guilty. We pull into the parking lot at the music school, and my son says, Mom, do you have your ID badge? And I said, no, sweetie, I'm parking in the gold parking spot. It's okay. I've got a parking pass. I don't need my ID badge to get in. And, I came straight from the airport. And he said, no, I just kind of like it when you wear that badge because it says that you're a doctor, and I'm really proud of you. So sometimes we're a little hard on ourselves.
That's great.
I think, though, that some of the policies that it's kind of seen as, I don't want to say the kiss of death, but thinking about going to part-time, thinking about taking those extra years on the tenure clock, or to apply, maybe you run out of eligibility for the K awards. Those things make it really hard for women during the childbearing years, and I think it's a systematic infrastructure.
So it's actually one of the topics that we're hoping to discuss in our first focus group, but I hope you volunteer or sign up on our sheet outside, because we want to continue that specific discussion about what can be done, because I think it's beyond kind of what we can do here in terms of what policies might need to be put in place. So if you don't mind signing up outside, we can definitely continue that discussion about that. Go ahead.
Hi, I just want to tell you the American College of Rheumatology has daycare and special lactation rooms at our meetings, so if you need examples, I can certainly hook you up. So I'm an assistant professor in internal medicine division of rheumatology, and I'm in the Valley of Death, the K to R transition. And I've been told by people through my years here that I have leadership potential. But what I'm lacking is sort of the specifics on actually how you transition into that. Because as a junior faculty, I've also been given the advice you have to protect your time, get your research, get your papers, get your grants. And so you try to learn the skill of saying no. And there doesn't seem to be like a obvious path of how you actually transition into some leadership roles. Like, you don't go from being an assistant professor to being chief or dean. So I guess what are your suggestions on sort of ways to transition into that, and maybe some examples of how you made those steps?
First of all, the K to R transition, if you're not enrolled in something like R01 boot camp, you are enrolled, so that's great. I think in that's actually probably the hardest phase of your career, and I personally would not say at this juncture to say yes to every service obligation on the planet. It's not the right time. Get your R01 funded, get going on that, get that well underway, and then people will come knocking because they will ask you to serve on committees, organizations, locally, regionally, nationally, study sections, and then you should start to say yes.
If I can make a comment, I found myself just in your position, many a moon ago, and it actually took me several submissions of my RO1 to get it funded. So persistence, please remember that. But once funded, or once you feel you've kind of gone over that hurdle, I would go back to the idea of sponsorship or mentorship, because that is when mentors truly became very valuable to me, to help select for me opportunities of leadership within the institution that I might not have known about, placed me on committees, which I felt I could finally do, editorial boards, asking me to speak at meetings. But that is a key time to identify not just one woman, one man, but I really do I believe in multiple mentors, because each mentor would be able to provide you with one or more aspects of what you need in order then for your full leadership potential to be clearly, understood.
Yeah, I have to say that I'm a firm believer in leading with your scholarship and assuring that you are defined by that. It's unlikely that someone is going to say that you are an internationally renowned administrator. Okay, but you could be an internationally renowned investigator of parathyroid adenoma genetics. And so I think, you set your sights on, what's most important to you. And I have to say that I did a lot of service as an assistant and associate professor, but I declined to consider a department chair position until I was a full professor. And at that time, I realized that I was doing so much service that it was probably about the same amount of time as it would take for me to be a department chair, but I would actually have some autonomy and say in what those activities would be, and that I could feel like I had an impact as well.
So this is an absolute critical phase, the K to R, for a young assistant professor, probably the most critical, and I too have lived through it. I've also lived through it watching many young people be successful and not be successful. So my advice to you is to turn down as many, if not all, of the diversions from the primary goal. Most of the successful individuals, that's not an issue for them, serving on a committee or doing X, Y, or Z. What I see that is the most critical factor is that you do not spend sufficient time preparing for that transition of that R grant, because it's a very different kind of grant than the K awards are, and that the young people sometimes that are not successful did not seek out enough input in advance of those submissions from a broad swath of people to get the kind of quality grant off that you need to do. So there are quite a few good people in this audience here today. Beth Moore is really good at critiquing grants. Is she?
I know.
Okay, so you're already
Tampa.
onto her. Sung
Perfect.
Choi, who's just down at the other end of the road there, has made that successful transition. So I think oftentimes knowing, and you need at least a year in advance. I tell all my young faculty, right, Durga?
Yep.
You need a year and a half minimum to prepare for that grant, and you need a lot of time and a lot of input. So any of you that are out there, I would really recommend you use time as your most important value metric and input from others in preparing that grant for that transition. Because it really, to me, the excuse is all the committees I signed up for, and the excuse is all, but really it's the preparation that is really key to being successful. That's my advice.
You've been standing up there for a while, so I'm going to get to your question. Go ahead.
Thank you. Sophina Taitano, I'm a graduate student in the immunology program. And so we talked a little bit about unconscious bias and how changing just the name from a female to a male makes you seem more competent as an applicant. And this kind of begs the question in my mind, like, why isn't there more of a push for applications to be gender neutral? So if you could just comment on like if there's a reason why there's not that kind of push, or if you
Janet,
think
would
it
you be
would
willing
work.
to comment on that on a national perspective about kind of blinded resumes and, you know, having things kind of come through without kind of names or gender on them for kind of
When
interview
you
process
apply
or
for something,
promotion?
though, you're applying as yourself, right? So I actually doesn't connect for me how we would do that.
I think it's really hard, even in grant applications, because you have to have letters of support. It's really difficult to blind who the person is, even if you put in just a first initial, last name for everything. Oftentimes, people are familiar. This is the whole phenomenon of networking at meetings: is that by the time they see your last name, they do actually know your gender. So I think it is really challenging to accomplish that beyond sort of a journal peer review level.
Hi, I'm Priyanka Gupta. I'm new faculty in the Department of Urology, and I actually have been speaking with a couple of other faculty, and one concern that a few of us have had is actually the maternity leave policy for new people coming from outside institutions, which requires you to have been on faculty for 2 years prior to maternity leave. And so if you've trained here, you don't have that issue, but for some of us coming from other institutions, I think that that is a bit of a barrier, and also when you're recruiting a lot of people finishing long training, I think that that feels like a little bit of a deterrent that you have to have that much time. So that's a question I would pose to leadership.
So it is a great question. So the medical school and the dental school are part of this thing we call the University of Michigan. There is sick leave policy, but there is no official maternity leave policy for staff or particularly for faculty. Tim Johnson is in the audience. Thank you for being here, and has been a big advocate for changing policies here. It is a conversation taking place at the highest levels of the organization. But what we have done in the medical school is put together a robust, modified duties arrangement, and modified duties are broadly defined, and many other colleges and schools can, for example, for people teaching a semester in the undergraduate campuses can give modified duties can include a semester off of teaching. But look at the modified duties policy. I suspect it's less well understood than it needs to be. It is posted online, and we can help make sure it is adhered to. But you have that as an executive approved policy. And then we are advocating for maternity, true maternity, and in addition to paternity leave policies, but they are not here yet.
So is that policy that you're speaking of, is that still relevant for people within their first 2 years of coming to the university, or do they also still have to wait 2 years?
It is relevant, in my opinion.
Okay. Just wanted to clarify to answer your question.
Yeah, and I had actually one other
Yes.
just comment too, is that, so I think one great program that we have is the backup care program that's here through the university, but I would actually encourage expanding that. So I tried to use it when I had an issue and I couldn't get somebody, so then I had issues with my clinic. And so that's, again, one of those things that I think we have room to expand to have more providers available so that, when you are in a bind, you can get someone so you don't have to cancel a clinic or something else.
Right, and I think, we've been hearing a lot about whether it's work-life integration balance, which I agree never exists, and we all have families, we all have friends. My 2 children are 21 and 24, and I have a non-physician but a full-time employed husband, and I would honestly say, as I moved on in my career, he took more and more ownership so that I could travel to meetings, and I do think that you make a huge difference in your kids' lives even by not always being present. But I see an ideal future state, if you will, of more balance in the parenting roles, and I encourage us, for those who choose to have children, to talk about that prospectively and say, okay, how are we going to work this out? and building a community network. You have to have 5 different solutions when the kid is sick or the nanny is sick or somebody else is sick, and what are you actually going to do? But there are moments in time when you as a parent have to drop everything and be there, and so be it. That is fine. It is the right thing to do. So I thank you. So I do think we have room to grow in our policies and procedures. There is flexibility in the faculty ranks for modified duties. You can do a lot of work at home. You can write papers, you can write grants. In fact, sometimes you can actually do better work at home than in the office with people knocking on the door. So I encourage you to explore those opportunities.
So can I ask a question, Carol? So I'm between you and Val. I have 3 children. And where I trained, there was 24-hour childcare at across the street from the hospital. I don't actually know if that continues, but has there been any discussion, because I know that that's a discussion in many AMCs, that there are actually 24-hour childcare on site? Is that something that the administration is considering or thinking about?
It's probably not currently on the radar screen, I would say, but it's, again, this group is helping inform leadership, so we look forward to your advice. You know, there is University of Michigan child care down on Glacier Road. There are many other child care options. There are in-home child care options. And I just think that choosing what's best for you for you and your family and your children is one of the options. But I think if that was it would be a huge investment, obviously, but if that is the one thing, then I think it should be on our radar screen. And what I was also going to say is, then what happens in my, at my phase of life is then our parents get ill. So my mother broke her hip in January, and now we've moved her into a nursing center situation, and she's actually doing reasonably well at 92. But again, we have families, communities, and sometimes they need us, and I think that that's really important.
And if you have other suggestions that haven't come up from this discussion, please do. We can kind of continue that discussion as well. Do you have a question as well?
So I came up to say something specific, but listening to the conversation has brought up a couple of other things. So first of all, the modified duties is actually not available to clinical lecturers, and a lot of junior faculty are hired in as clinical lecturers, and you can be a clinical lecturer for 4 years before you have to be promoted or have to leave, is how my understanding is. So the modified duty is only available to assistant professors or tracked people, So that actually becomes a problem when a lot of women and men are hired in at their kind of prime of their reproductive stage of their lives into a career. So you should be aware of that, because that's a problem. The second is kid care.
If I could comment upon that just one at a time. So so I think that our departments vary widely in the use of the clinical lecturer. For many of us, including the department that I am from, otolaryngology, that is a specific time-limited track that is mostly for non-ACGME approved fellows. So but it varies by department. So it's interesting to know that other departments are utilizing that extensively. The clinical track assistant professor slot is could be a very appropriate slot for a young clinical faculty member who's going to spend a lot of their time seeing patients. Historically, and again, Margaret is not here to correct me if I misspeak, and it's all posted. I mean, historically, you had to have one scholarly paper. Perhaps now in the new guidelines, you can have one scholarly anything or a number of things. But I think that that's an important thing for us to look at, and it should go on the list.
A lot of departments that I know of are similarly using the clinical lecturer years as a transition actually from T to R, I'd say, or some sort of training to, or K. I mean, they're using it kind of more loosely before choosing what kind of track they're going to be on. So it is kind of a critical window like you're talking about.
I actually came up to say that I have been offered to go part-time as a solution to my work, research, clinical work, research work, family life balance, and I find it really offensive. I think that, you know, women, men who go into academic medicine, while they may not be able to verbalize, women may not be able to verbalize the same kinds of aspirations as men easily. I think the fact that women even show up in academic medicine says what their aspirations are. We want to be leaders, whether it be leader of a resident and fellow team, whether it be leader within our division, our department, our institution. And so part-time offerings of work are not helpful or constructive. It should be more, how can we make it so that you have the time to be successful? How can I provide you with the skills and support to be successful? And I would encourage every single person in this room who's not a division chief or chair, or who is and is rounding on the floors, to take kind of personal interest in the medical students and residents and fellows that you're rounding with, to ask them who they are, where they come from, why they're there, and what they want to do as their next steps, because that's the first kind of instance in which we can intervene to prevent the attrition. So when you actually take an interest and show them what it is to be a leader on a team or a leader within an institution, that actually bolsters their own kind of sense of what it is to be a doctor, a scientist, an investigator within an institution, and to not offer to them, yes, it's hard and you can do it only. And I always appreciated that, but kind of real feet on the ground, small tidbits of how to make it work. And that's my small tidbit to you and how to make it work, is to actually start in the very beginning and talk about what it is to have children as a physician or a scientist. And not just with the women, but also with the men, because nothing will change for us women without an equal buy-in from the men. It has to be. And so I feel like if we don't talk about having children with both the women and the men medical students and residents, the men continue to be socialized to think that that is women's problem. And then they go on to become attending physicians and chiefs, and they continue to treat it as women's problem. But it is not A, a problem, and B, it is, I think, our charge to encourage men to be active partners and active participants, not only in their partners' lives, but in their children's lives, because that is how we change society and raise people that are good and inherently want to be a part of the culture. My husband has come a long way from the time that we were married, and he is the only reason I am successful at this juncture is because of his complete buy-in. But he didn't come to me that way, you know, and he didn't
train him.
tell you. But it is by watching and listening and learning that he has also realized how much of kind of a force he is in guaranteeing my own career success. I've spent a lot of time talking.
I really
Thank
appreciate
you.
your comments there. I'm not sure that we had a question there, but I think you highlighted a lot of really great points. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next question then. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm Zach Carlson. I'm an undergraduate researcher at the Brehm Center. And it was mentioned a few times about like the lack of male attendance here. And I can't speak for all the males, but personally, my hesitation comes from fear of overspeaking and not using like my privilege correctly in advocating for women's rights and the rights of people of color. So I've noticed in the recent years more and more opportunities to intervene as a privileged person, to act, and my problem is like I just don't know how to do it correctly and not make it about myself and not mansplain. So
no, definitely.
I guess I know it was mentioned in the previous talks, some suggestions for like helping women excel, but I guess my question is, are there additional ways in which I can use my privilege correctly to advocate for women? and extending that scope to the rights of people of color.
So one of the things. Thank you for being here. So one of the things we're actively working on right now is bystander training. The university has it for the undergraduates in the central campus, and we need to figure out how to modify it in the training for the academic medical center. Again, we're dealing with 40,000 people, so we need to, before we announce a program, we need to have all the infrastructure in place. But that is something that you should be able to participate in on Central Campus or on this campus to help you use your privilege to its best.
So I want to thank you for your comments, and I want to give you an example of something I observed and that was really powerful, because sometimes examples can reinforce things. So I attended a meeting of my HEMONC division where there was a presenter presenting, and the presenter made a comment to a member of our faculty that was, to me, totally inappropriate. And I was uncomfortable in my seat, but I wasn't sure if I was the only one in the room that felt uncomfortable. So at the end of this meeting, I walked out and I asked the person that the comment had been made to, was it just me, or did you feel something uncomfortable by the comment that was made towards you? And this individual said, I didn't know how to react because I was so dumbfounded. So I said, okay, well, if that's how you felt and that's how I felt, then clearly there might have been other people in the room. And so the person organizing this little conference, I asked them to ask the speaker if they felt that they might have overstepped their bounds with the comment that they had made directed at this individual. And the speaker said, I absolutely did. The minute the words came out of my mouth, I knew I had made a mistake. And so this was relayed back to me as and I said, well, what are we going to do with this? So we called everybody back, and the speaker had an opportunity to address the group and say, look, this happened, and I'm really sorry, and I apologize. And everybody got a chance to debrief. So after that happened to me, every time I'm in a scenario now where I see something and I observe something, and I think anybody can do this. You can walk out of the room and say, I really felt uncomfortable with what just transpired. And as a leader, I do that now. In a meeting of the chairs, not too long ago, somebody made a comment, and I thought it was totally unfair and inappropriate, and if I was feeling uncomfortable, it was likely somebody else was too. So I think anytime you're in those kind of situations, you can respectfully just call it out in a way that's comfortable for you at any level of the organization. And I think if we get to that level, then we can start to change some of the things that we observe day in and day out that send the message to people that isn't intended. And it gives people a chance to have a learning experience, I think, too, to help them to be better individuals. So that would be my advice to you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being willing to be part of that solution. And I think that's the direction we have to go in as a community.
And so building on what Val just said, we can all get better when we feel dumbfounded or confused or angry about something that's been said, to find a way to go toward it. So, for instance, when you're with a group of your male and female friends, if somebody says something that makes you wonder about where is that coming from, to be able to ask a question, help me understand what you meant when you said, because this is how I interpreted it. Is that accurate? And so trying to create dialogue, and we can all get better at creating dialogue around unprofessional or confusing statements that detract from our collegiality.
Do something quick, Dr.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, recognizing, Dr. Paperi, you're a leader, you have power, but often there's a power differential in that. So I think what I also heard in the question is, how do I become empowered when the people who I might have to say, this isn't right, or we have to talk about this differently, there's a power differential. One of the things we've done in the Cardiovascular Center, and it was designed around a patient safety initiative and a culture initiative. We actually have a culture committee. We created a called TEMPO, which stands for Together Everyone Molds Patient Outcomes. And so what that word, and we did implement this as part of the culture, was meant, so for instance, if an attending physician walks into a room without washing his or her hands, or there's some unsafe moment, or maybe somebody's having a heated conversation in front of a patient, anybody, regardless of the authority differential, would be able to say tempo, which would be recognized, and the only response to tempo we ever allowed was thank you. No discussion in front of a patient. We'd take it out, and then, and I think that sort of thing was meant so that, for instance, somebody on the housekeeping staff could call a tempo on somebody to remove that the power differential and change the culture. So I would be a fan of having some type of safe moment sort of thing like that, where we now, in a faculty meeting, for instance, if somebody makes what might be a gender harassing comment or an insensitive comment, on our faculty, somebody says tempo, and that conversation stops, or is taken out into the hall to be continued in a different way. So just to relieve that power differential.
Yeah, it's a great initiative. Hi, I'm Charlene Day. I'm an associate professor in cardiovascular medicine. David is my chief, as well as two of the previous people who asked questions. I've someone that has always been a minority as a woman, so I went to a very science techie undergrad school, where I had to fight to get the women's track team varsity status when the men had varsity status for many years, and so I'm sort of used to this. And I went to cardiology, where I think when I started here, I was one of maybe 3 women faculty out of 50 or 60, and that's changed, although there's still a differential in my division. But I remember just a quick story that I went out. David used to invite me to a lot of recruiting dinners. I don't know if you remember this, that I had maybe a glass or 2, or I don't remember how much wine. And I said, I think, David, you just invite me because, as a woman representative. And he said, well, I did happen to notice that you're a good eater and you always order dessert. so touche on that one. So I, was falsely accused. I think I wanted to echo some of the other comments pertaining to family. And I feel like, to use something from Janet's presentation, I think we hamper ourselves by identifying family issues as women's issues. And, we're constantly, as women faculty, tapped to ask, by mostly women mentees to talk about work-life balance, integration. Very few men ever approach me, and I don't think many of my men colleagues are probably approached to talk about those things. I constantly get asked, how do you do it all? And I just don't think that question gets asked of a lot of men faculty. It's just sort of assumed that they have a support network, that allows them to sort of work late hours or do what they need to do, and that, somebody else is taking care of their family and kids and, the laundry and dishes and all that. I'm very fortunate that I do have a husband that's a very equal partner in family life. We may have some disagreements over little things here and there, but for the most part, he has been incredibly supportive. We actually did use modified duties. We adopted our children. That was actually sort of a hard policy to find. I think that there could be a little bit more transparency as to what those duties are. But I think they actually just came into effect the year that we adopted our first child. And so both of us went 50% for 4 months in order to raise our children. So, I think that we need to sort of be aware that family issues are distinct from women's issues. And I'd like to hear just maybe some comments about, one, how we can really fully implement that, like action items, I guess, that would allow us to fully make that distinction. And then secondly, how we can refocus women's issues on where the gaps are, the gaps that you identified in promotion, in leadership issues, and for people that are otherwise equally qualified and have equal career aspirations. So who would like to speak on the idea of kind of educating it and making it more of kind of a general discussion about family, as opposed to making sure that we're not focusing it so much on the women faculty?
So thanks for those comments, Charlene. I've known Charlene for years. We used to play tennis. We were a fierce tennis team until she gave that up, and still runs, I know. So I think it's a societal issue. About who has primary responsibility for family and children, and probably a personal decision in every, in every household, if you will, and in every family. And again, I encourage us to think more broadly, because it can be siblings, it can be parents, it can be all sorts of individuals. But I agree with a great strategy of partnership and not having the significant burden rest upon the female faculty member. But the data suggests that still today, the data is hard to argue with. The graphs of 8.5 hours more per week for women as compared to female as compared to male faculty. But I think, again, I think that is a strategy to improve. But I think your real question, Charlene, I can't see where you're sitting because of the bright light, but is how do we identify, call those really family issues, not women's issues, and then how do we address the obstacles that exist in all of our faculty reaching their career aspirations, but especially where disparities lie. And I think the reasons are multifactorial. I think for women, I think it's leaky pipeline. I think it's insufficient sponsorship, mentorship, and coaching. And I also think it's glass ceilings and about 200 other things. I was pretty compelled by, and I don't know the person's name, that told the story of the lecturer and no leave and no support. And I think, there you are. So I found that very compelling, and it tells me that we're not doing a good enough job. So it's prompted me to say why, and I think the why for lecturers is because you don't start the tenure clock if you're going to be a tenure track faculty member, but are there other solutions, or do we need to open up the modified duties for other tracks as well? But it just feels like we must do a better job. We must provide a better network of support for all of us to be successful. And it's a two-way street in terms of finding the support to do, and I have to tell a story about the part-time. So we should not impose part-time or full-time, status upon people. Quite the contrary. When I was department chair, I had 2 faculty members, one a tenured track full professor who his whole career, great faculty member, took Fridays off and it wasn't in the office. He didn't take them off. That's when he did all of his scholarly work. He wrote papers, wrote book chapters, and did all of his scholarly work, prepared. And he was internationally famous. And then there was a female junior clinical track faculty who was working 0.7 or 0.8 effort, doing equivalent scholarly work, but she felt if she didn't show up at the office to do her work, she couldn't possibly be full-time. And I pointed out to her this obvious inequity in a male and a female member of the same department. And I said, you can, everybody, even clinical track faculty, have a day to do everything else in otolaryngology. We expect 4 days a week, not 5 days a week. And the 5th day, we're not going to ask you where you are. You're productive, you're doing all the things for promotion. And so, why don't you consider going back to full-time and then utilize that day, and you can work at home, you can work on, I don't care if you do the scholarly work on Saturday or Sunday, but just, achieve your career objectives. And so I think flexibility is key, and I just encourage you to reach out. Like Valerie said, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to engage, figuring out how we can better strategize and support you as a faculty member here.
So I'm going to let Dr. McCauley comment as well, and then we'll go to our last question.
And this is, I think, just a comment on what I think the second part of Charlene's question was. And I would just say that I also know Charlene from swimming. So and she's quite an athlete. And but I think what you asked is about equity in ranks and progression through ranks. And one of the eye-opening things for me, and I really appreciate the university for requesting that we do this, is early on when I was dean, I had to go through an exhaustive exercise of all our faculty in their ranks, looking at gender, underrepresented minorities for salary equity, but it went deeper than that because I had to show that, for instance, individuals were not in the associate professor rank longer if they were female than male because they weren't progressing, in a timely manner. And they also gave pushback on the fact that I said, well, the salary equity, because our chairs have higher salaries, they shouldn't be in the pool of full professors. And they, opened my eyes to say, well, I guess that just shows you that you have some inequity in the gender of your chairs because we had all male chairs at that time. So I think the point is that going through exercises like that is eye-opening, and it was something that I then transferred to the department so that they were aware. Fortunately, we didn't have huge issues, but there were some issues that needed to be addressed, and I think I would have perhaps been oblivious to them without having to go through that.
Great. I think we'll take one last question here.
Yeah, I wanted to ask this specifically of Janet and Reshma. So I am a full professor, and my husband is tenured faculty. We're both in the medical school here. We have 3 kids. It all worked out. But what I'm finding now in a mentoring role is that I'm having the women who are like half a generation below me, so like women who are like in their 30s, and they're coming to my office, and they're crying behind a closed door because their question for me is, how do I navigate this with my husband? So we're talking all about like the kids, but what we're not talking about is that these women are coming to me and saying, I don't think my husband would take a hit to his career so that we could move to a new institution for my career. And this was a recruit outside of the medical school, but I got this phone call from a woman considering to take a job offer here at U of M that was this outstanding package. And she just emailed me and said, do you have time to talk tomorrow? And I said, sure. And I thought, I wonder if this is going to be about the startup package. Like, what is it going to be about? And we got on the phone and she said, I can't convince my husband to take a hit to his career to follow me here. And I think if I don't take the job here, I won't have a career, because this was like her assistant professor position. And she said, do you have advice for me about how to navigate this with my husband? And yeah, the looks on people's faces.
Yeah, I just want Janet to go first.
Yeah. Like, data on this? Like, what do we say?
Well, those kinds of issues, I think, fall outside of the mentor role to some extent. And because each marriage is a miracle and a gamble and a compromise. And so if he is unwilling to compromise in a situation like this, there's probably nothing and no one that can convince him. That's an issue between the two of them. And if I were you, I wouldn't feel competent to give them advice about that.
I agree, I don't feel competent, but I'm getting asked this all the time.
They might need a therapist to help work. No, seriously, that's what marriage counselors do.
So beyond encouraging marriage counseling, I mean, I think that the change has to happen through role modeling. I think that, my example of my son does not think that one would follow him necessarily for his career. I mean, he's only 8 years old, but I think it's very clear to him that we take turns in life. My husband is actually a pretty high-powered academic himself. I followed him here. He was on the law faculty, and I left a job that at the time that I wanted more to come here, and our agreement is that the next move is mine. So if I want to go somewhere else, that decision will be mine.
That's what I tell them.
But
I say just trade off.
Exactly, and so you can try to do that, but if someone's not willing to compromise, I don't know how you fix that.
Well, I think that there obviously could be a lot more discussion, but I'm just looking at my watch now. It's already 11 o'clock. So I really would like to thank our panelists for being involved in this today and accepting our invitation to do this, and also everyone in the audience for engaging in the discussion.